There is a specific kind of exhaustion that never shows up on a medical chart. It's the exhaustion of someone who does everything right. Wakes early, tracks habits, reads the books, follows the routines, disciplines every visible corner of their life, and still feels, somewhere underneath all that structure, quietly empty. Not lazy, not unmotivated, just hollow, in a way that more discipline never seems to fix, no matter how rigorously it's applied. If you've ever built the perfect routine and still felt like something was wrong with you, this is not a coincidence, and it is not a personal failure. It's a trap, a specific psychological trap, hiding inside the very thing our culture worships as the solution to almost everything. Here's the uncomfortable premise this video is going to sit with, slowly, without rushing past it. Discipline, the very trait you've been told will fix your life, can become the exact mechanism that quietly ruins it. Not because discipline is bad, but because of what it's often secretly being used to avoid. By the end of this, you'll understand why some of the most disciplined people you know are also some of the most disconnected from themselves. And you'll understand something far more personal, whether the discipline you're so proud of is actually building the life you want, or simply managing a feeling you've never had the courage to look at directly. Picture someone who wakes at 5 every morning without fail. Cold showers, a rigid diet, a calendar blocked in 15-minute intervals. On the surface, this looks like mastery, the kind of self-command everyone claims to want. Colleagues admire it. Friends ask for advice. And yet, late at night, alone, this same person feels an anxiety they can't name. A restlessness that no new habit seems to touch, as if the structure itself has become a cage they built with their own hands and now cannot find the door out of. Most people watching this would assume the solution is simple: build even more discipline, tighten the system further, add one more habit to fix the gap the last 10 habits didn't close. But that assumption is exactly where the trap begins, because it treats discipline as the answer to a problem discipline was never designed to solve in the first place. This is where psychology gets uncomfortable. Because discipline, in its healthiest form, is a tool, a means of aligning daily behavior with genuine long-term values. But discipline can also function as something else entirely, a highly effective, culturally praised form of avoidance. When someone fills every waking hour with structured productivity, they rarely have to sit with the quieter, more uncomfortable questions underneath questions about whether they actually like the life they're building, whether the relationships around them are genuinely fulfilling, whether the exhaustion they feel is fatigue from effort or fatigue from denial. Discipline, used this way, doesn't build a life. It postpones a reckoning. This single distinction explains a pattern that confuses almost everyone who encounters it, why some extraordinarily disciplined, outwardly successful people report feeling more lost than people with far less structure in their lives. Their discipline was never actually pointed at growth. It was quietly pointed at escape, dressed up so convincingly as ambition that even the person living it couldn't tell the difference. But that isn't even the real problem. The real problem is something Carl Jung spent decades trying to articulate through his work on the persona and the shadow. Jung observed that human beings construct a curated public identity, a persona built largely to be acceptable, admirable, and safe within their social world. The parts of the self that don't fit that curated identity don't disappear. They get pushed into what Jung called the shadow, an unconscious reservoir of everything a person has decided is unacceptable to acknowledge, including grief, doubt, longing, or exhaustion that doesn't match the image they've built. Rigid discipline, taken to its extreme, often becomes an elaborate persona, the disciplined one, the reliable one, the one who never breaks, constructed so completely that even quiet moments of doubt feel like a threat to identity itself. And so those moments get suppressed, scheduled over, disciplined away before they can even be examined. The shadow doesn't vanish because you filled your calendar. It waits, and it tends to surface eventually, often at the exact moment the external structure finally cracks a burnout, an unexplained breakdown, a sudden and bewildering loss of motivation in someone who has never once, in years, missed a single morning routine. This is the part that changes everything. Because the question was never simply, am I disciplined? The deeper, far more uncomfortable question is, what is my discipline actually protecting me from feeling? And most people have never once paused long enough to ask it. Because the discipline itself is precisely what prevents the pause. Something even more dangerous is happening beneath even this layer, though. Alfred Adler proposed that a significant portion of human striving is compensatory, that people develop, often early in life, a sense of inferiority in some specific area, and then spend years unconsciously organizing their behavior around either overcoming that inferiority or preventing it from ever being exposed. Rigid, excessive discipline frequently functions as exactly this kind of compensation. If somewhere in your history you absorbed the belief that you were only valuable when you were achieving, productive, or in control, then discipline stops being a chosen tool and becomes a compulsive requirement, not something you do, but something you cannot stop doing without triggering the exact feeling of worthlessness the discipline was built to outrun in the first place. This reframes an entire category of behavior most people never question. The person who cannot rest without guilt. The person who feels physically anxious on a day with no plan. The person whose identity seems to collapse the moment their productivity does. None of this is really about discipline anymore. It's about a nervous system that learned, somewhere early, that stillness itself is dangerous, that the moment structure disappears, an old, unbearable feeling of not being enough will rush back in to fill the space. Think about the last time you had a completely unstructured day, no obligations, nowhere to be. If any part of you felt genuine unease rather than relief, that unease is worth examining closely, because it's rarely about the day itself. It's about what that empty space threatens to reveal. Some people fill that silence within minutes, a chore that didn't need doing today, a task pulled forward from tomorrow, a workout added on impulse simply to feel the day was earned. The speed of that reflex is itself a kind of answer, even before any conscious thought has had the chance to form a question. Most people never notice what comes next, because it requires a level of honesty most self-improvement culture actively discourages. Discipline has become, in the modern world, one of the most socially rewarded forms of self-abandonment available. Nobody questions the person who works constantly, who never rests, who treats every hour as an opportunity for optimization. That person is celebrated, admired, held up as an example. Which means the trap isn't just internal, it's reinforced from the outside, by an entire culture that mistakes constant motion for genuine well-being, and treats stillness, reflection, or emotional processing as unproductive, even suspicious. This creates a particularly cruel psychological bind. The very behavior that might be quietly harming someone, the relentless, joyless discipline used to outrun feeling, is the exact behavior everyone around them is praising. There is no external signal telling them to stop, because from the outside, nothing looks wrong. Everything looks like success. The suffering stays entirely private, invisible even to the person experiencing it, because they've been taught their entire life that discomfort is simply the price of achievement, rather than a signal that something underneath the achievement needs attention. This is where the trap becomes almost invisible, because the very language available to describe the problem, laziness, lack of willpower, needing more structure, points people in exactly the wrong direction. There is no cultural vocabulary for your discipline has become a defense mechanism. So people keep adding more structure to a problem that structure cannot solve. The way someone might keep reinforcing a wall to stop water they can't see is coming from beneath the floor. Viktor Frankl offers something crucial here, drawn from his years studying human suffering and meaning. Frankl observed that human beings can endure almost any external hardship if that hardship serves a meaning they genuinely believe in. But he also observed something less discussed, that activity without meaning, no matter how intense or disciplined, produces its own particular form of despair, an emptiness he called the existential vacuum. Discipline detached from genuine purpose doesn't protect against this vacuum. It often accelerates the person straight into it, simply with better posture and a more impressive calendar. Evolutionary psychology adds a layer that makes this pattern even easier to understand. For most of human history, status within the group was directly tied to survival, visible competence, visible productivity, and visible contribution to the tribe were not optional traits. They were protective ones. A person who appeared consistently capable and industrious was less likely to be abandoned, excluded, or left vulnerable. That ancient calculation still runs quietly beneath modern behavior, which is part of why relentless productivity feels so instinctively safe, and why rest can feel, at a level beneath conscious thought, like a subtle risk to one's standing. Nobody today is at risk of being cast out of a tribe for taking a day off. But the nervous system carrying that old wiring doesn't always know that, and it will sometimes generate the same low hum of alarm regardless. This is compounded by a cognitive bias worth naming, directly the tendency to equate visible effort with genuine worth, sometimes called the effort heuristic. People, including the person doing the striving, instinctively judge value by how much visible struggle went into producing it. This means a life built on constant, effortful discipline will always feel more legitimate, more earned, more defensible than a life that includes real rest, regardless of which one actually produces well-being. The bias rewards exhaustion with a feeling of moral credit, which makes it extraordinarily difficult to step back from relentless discipline, even once its cost becomes obvious, because stepping back feels, falsely, like becoming lesser. This is where psychology becomes genuinely uncomfortable, because it forces a distinction most people have never consciously made: the difference between discipline in service of a life you actually want and discipline in service of an identity you're afraid to lose. Imagine two people who both wake at 5 every morning to train. The first person trains because they've built a genuine relationship with the sport, because the discomfort of training connects to something they actually value: health, mastery, a version of themselves they respect. The discipline feels demanding, but underneath the demand is something closer to devotion. The second person trains at the exact same hour, with the exact same intensity. But underneath the discipline is a quiet, constant fear, the fear of what happens to their sense of self the moment they stop. For this person, training isn't devotion. It's avoidance wearing devotion's clothing, indistinguishable from the outside, entirely different underneath. Both people will look identical on social media. Both will be praised for their discipline. But only one of them is actually building something. The other is running, as fast and as structured as possible, from something they've never let themselves name. This distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire exploration, because it determines whether discipline heals or quietly harms. Behavioral psychology offers a useful lens here: the difference between approach motivation and avoidance motivation. Approach motivation moves towards something desired. Avoidance motivation moves away from something feared. Both can produce identical behavior from the outside, but research consistently shows that avoidance-driven effort correlates with significantly higher anxiety, lower life satisfaction, and a much greater risk of eventual burnout, even when the outward achievement looks the same. There's a particular tell that separates the two, if you know where to look for it. Ask an approach-driven person why they train, and the answer usually points forward towards something they're building, becoming, or working to experience more fully. Ask an avoidance-driven person the same question, and after enough probing, the answer tends to point backward, towards something they're afraid of returning to, a version of themselves they associate with failure, worthlessness, or being left behind. The forward-facing answer feels expansive. The backward-facing answer, however articulate, carries an undertone of dread that no amount of achievement seems to resolve, because achievement was never actually the target. Distance from the old feeling was. Which means the question was never how disciplined are you? The real question, the one almost nobody asks, is what are you moving toward, and what are you running from, and are you even sure you know the difference anymore? The Stoics, surprisingly, understood this distinction with remarkable clarity, even though they're often misread as advocates for relentless self-control at any cost. Seneca warned repeatedly against what he called busyness, without purpose activity mistaken for meaning, motion mistaken for progress. He observed that people often fill their days precisely to avoid confronting how empty those days would feel in silence. Marcus Aurelius, for all his famous discipline, wrote obsessively about examining his own motives, returning again and again to the question of why he was doing what he was doing, not simply whether he was doing it consistently. The Stoics were never interested in discipline for its own sake. They were interested in discipline in service of a life examined honestly, which is precisely the step most modern discipline culture skips entirely. So, how do you actually know in your own life which kind of discipline you're practicing? It starts with noticing the emotional texture of rest, not just the presence or absence of productivity. Approach-driven discipline generally allows for genuine rest without guilt, because the identity underneath isn't threatened by stillness. Avoidance-driven discipline treats rest as dangerous, generating anxiety, restlessness, or a compulsive need to find something, anything to be productive about, even during moments explicitly set aside for recovery. It continues with examining what happens internally when a routine is broken. If missing a single workout, a single early morning, a single item on the to-do list triggers a disproportionate emotional reaction, shame, panic, a collapse in self-worth far beyond what the actual missed task warrants, that reaction is data. It suggests the routine was never simply a tool. It had quietly become load-bearing for an entire identity, which means its absence doesn't just interrupt a habit. It threatens a self-concept built almost entirely on top of it. It requires asking, honestly, what specific feeling tends to arrive in the rare moments when structure disappears completely, a question most people have never actually let themselves sit with long enough to answer. Because the discipline itself has always arrived first, cutting the question off before it could fully form. And it requires the willingness to let some structure go, temporarily, deliberately, as an experiment, not to become undisciplined, but to discover what surfaces underneath the discipline when it's no longer available to manage the feeling. This is often the most difficult and most revealing step of all, because it asks a person to voluntarily sit with exactly the discomfort their entire system was built to avoid. Most people never take this step willingly. They take it only when life forces it on them: an injury, a burnout, a season that collapses the routine against their will, and it is only then, often for the first time in years, that the feeling underneath finally gets the silence it needs to be heard. There is a strange, quiet relief hidden inside this entire realization, if you allow yourself to actually feel it. You were never asked to abandon discipline. Discipline, genuinely rooted in purpose, remains one of the most powerful tools a human being has ever developed. The capacity to align daily action with long-term value is not the enemy here, and never was. What's being questioned is something far more specific and far more personal: whether your particular relationship with discipline is building a life you actually want to live, or managing a feeling you've never given yourself permission to face directly. This isn't a call to become less disciplined. It's an invitation to become more honest about what your discipline has actually been doing, quietly, in the background, for however many years it's been running the show. Because a life built entirely on top of avoidance can look successful for a very long time before the foundation finally makes itself known, and by then, the cost of finding out is almost always higher than the cost of asking the question now. while there's still time to actually choose. There is also something worth saying to anyone who recognizes themselves in this and feels a wave of shame rather than clarity. That shame is, itself, often another layer of the same pattern, the instinct to immediately judge, fix, or discipline away whatever feeling just surfaced, rather than simply letting it exist long enough to be understood. The goal was never to add self-criticism to the pile. It was to interrupt, for even a moment, the automatic reflex that turns every uncomfortable realization into another item to optimize. Sometimes, the most disciplined act available isn't doing more. It's staying still long enough to actually feel what the doing has been covering. And maybe that's the real question worth carrying with you long after this video ends, quieter and more uncomfortable than anything discussed so far. If you stopped being disciplined for just one day, what feeling would finally have the space to catch up with you? If this kind of psychology, the kind that questions the very things our culture tells you never to question, is something you genuinely connect with, stay close. There's more of this waiting for those who are actually ready to look.